What's up, everybody? Welcome to Stat Chasing. I'm here to get everyone ready for the week 4, looking back at week 3 and trying to make sense of everything that just happened. If you have not watched the show before, this is where I'm going to be going through some of the key stats that I think are important to help lay a foundation for understanding what happened this past week over the past couple weeks. And we'll be going through positions, a couple different teams, and hope to give you some good information. But before we get into the details, want to talk through the stats that I'll be sharing on the show today. From PFF, I have routes data, so that includes targets per route run, pretty much any route metric that I share on the show. Also using expected fantasy points from PFF. This is a model that weights opportunity by the line of scrimmage, the time left, the passing, or excuse me, whether it's a pass or run. And I really use this as a measure of usage. It shows a little bit better which players are getting the more high value opportunities in fantasy football. And then from the NFL play-by-play data, NFL Faster, that's where I get the majority of my stats. So that's air yards, which is the distance the ball traveled in the air before it gets to the receiver. Whopper, which is weighted opportunity rating, a stat that Josh Hermsmeyer came up with that weights both target share and air yards share. We have Racer, which is receiver air conversion ratio, which is receiving yards divided by air yards, and is essentially a receiver's ability to convert air yards into actual receiving yards. On the flip side, we have Pacer, which is passing air conversion ratio, which is how well quarterbacks and the receivers are converting air yards into actual yards. That's passing yards divided by passing air yards. Quarterback adjusted yards per attempt, which is yards per attempt completed, but weights it with interceptions and touchdowns. And then lastly, we'll be referencing pass rate over expectation, which is from the NFL Faster play-by-play model, which essentially says how often a team is passing more or less than they would expect to be based on the game situation. Also have a couple stats that have been popularized by Ben Gretsch. We have weighted targets per route run, which weights air yards and routes run with a scaler included to show a little bit more which guys are getting downfield targets. And then high value touches, which are running back specific, that is carries inside the 10-yard line, and receptions. I'll also reference green zone touches, which are any touch inside the opponent's 10-yard line. So like I mentioned at the top of the show, we'll be going through the stats position by position so that I can compare against others within the position, hope to help you make your start sit or waiver or trade decisions in your league. And then I'll be going a bit more in depth through some team situations at the end that stood out to me and a couple of people on the Discord. Speaking of, a reminder to subscribe to the YouTube channel and become a member for just $5 to get early access to this show. You could be watching this show live. Hope there are plenty of you watching right now, and a couple other benefits as well. One quick shout out to @ChangeCollege on Twitter, who will be adding timestamps for the YouTube video for each positions and the team conversations as well. Before I get into things, I want to take a minute here. I'd be remiss if I didn't bring up the passing of Mike Tiglier, who passed away this past weekend due to COVID. It's really a terrible situation. It's amazing how well the community has rallied around him. I think they've raised over $300,000 for that family so far, and no amount of money can bring him back, but it's pretty awesome to see that. And I've been doing stat chasing. This is now my third week, and it's quite a bit of work. And Mike, each week during the season, he spent time writing a 30,000 word column on top of podcasting, on top of being a great father and a great husband and doing other writing. And I had the chance to podcast with him once last summer. And he was so generous with his time. He talked with my friend and I like we were lifelong friends and just loved talking about fantasy football. So we certainly miss you, Mike. Rest in peace, and hope that we can make you proud. Okay, I'm going to start off with the quarterback position. And the charts that I'm showing today are going to be a little bit different. I'm going to be showing two charts, and I'll switch between the two about halfway through each section, but I'll be showing a rolling average over right now it's the last 3 weeks, so the entire season so far, and then just the same chart, but from the prior week. So in this case, it'll be week 3. It's going to show the same data, just over different time frames. And with the quarterbacks here, we have adjusted yards per attempt on the x-axis, touchdown rate, which is looking for efficiency from quarterbacks on the y-axis, and then the size of a player's bubble is his rushing yards. So I'm going to start off the quarterback conversation with, someone who I think went into the season with a ton of expectations and certainly hasn't fallen short of expectations, but I think their team sort of has, and that's Joe Burrow with the Cincinnati Bengals. I talked about their receivers last week. Unfortunately, T. Higgins missed the game in week 3, but their whole receiving core is having a great start to the season. But I want to talk about Burrow, who is currently outside the top 20 quarterbacks in fantasy points so far this season. He's been saved by that trio of receivers, including Boyd, Jamar Chase, and Higgins, because Burrow has a pacer of 1.05. So basically for every air yard, his receivers are converting 5% more into receiving yards. That is on top of a 9% touchdown rate. You can see him on the chart here. He's 3rd in the league in touchdown rate right now. This is typically not sustainable, except for guys like Aaron Rodgers, Patrick Mahomes. Russell Wilson is also always up there in career touchdown rate, but he's only averaging 213 passing yards per game, just under 25 attempts per game. His adjusted yards per attempt of 8.1 isn't that bad. He's above the league median right now, and it's not that bad, especially given that he has 4 interceptions on the year. You might have seen Mike Leone shares a pass rate over expectation chart each week that I help put together, and the Bengals are dead last in pass rate over expectation, which is just not great at all. They're certainly content running the ball with Joe Mixon when they have the chance to. And the big worry here, I think, is that it's working for them and they really don't have any incentive to throw the ball anymore because they have been winning with the pass rate that they have. But it's not helping Joe Burrow. He really probably needs that higher passing rate to hit his ceiling and hit the ceiling that everyone expected. I don't think I'm dropping Burrow in one quarterback leagues at this point, but until the Bengals start passing more, like I said, he's not going to hit his ceiling. I'd look for potentially other options to start instead of him, and might talk about a couple of those coming up here. And someone that I probably would be looking for a replacement for is Trevor Lawrence, the rookie number 1 overall pick drafted by the Jacksonville Jaguars. At this point, unfortunately, I might be able to burn my offensive rookie of the year tickets for him because he has not looked great. He looked a little bit better this past week playing the Cardinals, but you can see he shows up here on the bottom left part of the chart, which is not where we want to see any of the players that we have on our teams. From a fantasy perspective, he's averaging just over 11 fantasy points per game. He has more interceptions than touchdowns, and he's averaged 369 air yards per game, which is outstanding and is a lot, but he's only turning that into 223 passing yards per game. So he's averaging about 15 more attempts per game than Burrow, but only has 10 more yards per game. So efficiency has not been on his side like it was all throughout college. They are throwing it plenty, like I just mentioned, but that talks to what I've mentioned a couple times on this show this year, is that volume does not necessarily equal success as a fantasy football quarterback. We're really looking for a lot of efficiency. He has a 3.88 adjusted yards per attempt, which is second worst in the league among the guys who have played in all 3 games, but he's got a 55% completion rate, a CPOE, which is another stat that I'll be talking through. That's completion percentage over expectation. His is at negative 10%, which is the worst among quarterbacks who have started all 3 games. Like I said, I'm likely looking elsewhere for a better option. I'd rather have, at this point, guys like Derek Carr, Ryan Tannehill, probably even Daniel Jones over Lawrence at this point until the Jaguars figure it out, which I'm not sure that they'll do with Urban Meyer calling plays, but does not look great for Trevor Lawrence through 3 games right now. So now I'm going to switch over to the week 3 only chart and talk about Jacoby Brissett, who had a solid day, at least from a fantasy perspective. He scored over 20 points, finished as a top 12 quarterback on the week, but I got to call him out for that egregious throw from the end zone. He targeted the guy so if you didn't see the play, Jacoby Brissett was in the end zone, his own end zone. He threw it to a guy who was also still in the end zone and had a defender right near him, and the defender tackled him for a safety. So it was just terrible, bad quarterbacking. But besides that, he threw for 215 yards on 391 air yards. That's a terrible 0.55 pacer. He had an average depth of target of about 8.6 yards, which is slightly up from the 7.9 yard ADOT that Tua had through the first 2 games. Where he made his money was rushing. You can see his bubble is among the bigger ones of these quarterbacks for week 3. He carried the ball 7 times for 37 yards. And I think if for some reason Tua is out a little bit longer than expected, Brissett has a pretty good schedule coming up. They play the Colts at home this week. They go to the Buccaneers, who have a pass funnel defense at this point. They then play at the Jaguars and then are home versus the Falcons. So whoever is under center for the Colts, whether it's Brissett or Tua, looks like he's setting up for a good stretch of games. I will point out that the Dolphins, they threw it 48 times, including overtime in this game. So keep that in mind. But as a quick target breakdown from that game, Jalen Waddle had 13 targets for a 28% target share. Mike Gesicki actually was second with 12 targets for 26% target share. Javonte Parker at 7 targets for a 15% target share. Will Fuller and Myles Gaskin both had 6 for a 13% target share, and nobody else had more than 2. So Jalen Waddle didn't have a very high average depth of target, but looked like Brissett's favorite target in this game. A couple of quick hitters before I move on to the running back position. Josh Allen is back on his shit, which is good to see. He was the high-scoring quarterback on the week, did it almost entirely with his arm this week, throwing for 358 yards and 4 touchdowns. He's still rushing about as much as he did last year. He's averaging 6 rush attempts per game this year and was at 6.4 rushes per game last year. So there was a little bit of a scare after week 1, not really performing that well, but the last 2 games, Josh Allen has shown why he was a quarterback selected in the top 6 rounds this year. On the flip side, Justin Fields' first start was not great. Got sacked 9 times. He could only rush for 12 yards. Hopefully better days are ahead, but that's assuming he's even the starter, and I don't really trust Matt Nagy enough to make the right decision. I'll be talking about the Bears wide receivers in a little bit here, and spoiler alert, it's not that pretty. But I'm going to move on to the running backs now. So again, here showing the averages for the first 3 weeks of the season. We have rushing expected fantasy points on the x-axis and receiving expected points on the y-axis, and then fantasy points over expectation, which is FPO, as I'll refer to as the size of a player's bucket. A player's bubble. I'm going to talk first about the Colts running backs, and maybe not that surprising, but Nyheim Hines currently has more fantasy points through 3 games than Jonathan Taylor does, which isn't very great. I know a lot of the ship chasing crew was on Taylor this offseason, including Sean Siegel. Fortunately, Marlon Mack is an afterthought. At this point, he was a healthy scratch on the week. There were some rumors today that it sounds like the Colts and Marlon Mack have mutually agreed to seek a trade for Mack. So wouldn't be surprised if a team like Baltimore or someone like that came in and tried to trade for him. But let's get more into these other 2 guys. Taylor, through 3 games, has a slight edge in snap share at 50% compared to 46% for Hines, but week 3 was the first time this season that Hines actually outsnapped Taylor in the game. And again, I see this sort of as a sign of good things to come, but Taylor is averaging -5 fantasy points over expectation per game so far this year. You can see his bubble is pretty small, and Hines is actually at +2 FPO per game. The reason I see that as a sign of good things to come is it means he's getting the opportunity. He's just not doing as much with it, which hopefully the talent wins out and he's able to produce eventually. But Hines has the edge in all of the receiving metrics, but having nearly 5 receiving expected points for Taylor is pretty good considering who he is competing against. Taylor has 3 green zone touches per game, which again is outstanding. But one thing, there was a stat from Jacob Gibbs of CBS looked at red zone snaps specifically, and Taylor is playing on 60% of the team's red zone snaps, which was not near the top, but it's more than Hines, so that's certainly good. And Taylor has yet to score a touchdown this season, which I think is another. So as bad as that is, it's hopefully a sign that he'll regress and score. Like I mentioned earlier, they play the Dolphins this week, who have not had a great defense. And going back to Hines, a lot of people discounted him thinking that Taylor would just overtake this backfield, but it looks like it's just more of the same from last year. And these two are just, in a split backfield at this point. The next backfield I'm going to talk through is that of the Washington football team. And there are honestly so many similarities between this backfield and the Colts backfield, because you have this, first or second round guy that people were drafting, hoping they would take over more of the receiving work, and the PPR back being drafted later that have some value in those PPR leagues and when the team gets down. But I'm going to talk about these guys real quick. Antonio Gibson has an average of 5.3 receiving expected points per game, which is more than McKissic. And like I mentioned before, Taylor's at just under 5 receiving expected points, and Nyheim Hines is up there in receiving expected points with about 6, I believe. But Gibson's 5.3 receiving EP per game is outside the top 20s running backs in receiving EP. In an extremely negative game script for the football team on Sunday, McKissic ran a season high 60% of routes on dropbacks, and this was despite the screen that Antonio Gibson took to the house for a 73-yard touchdown. You would have thought that might give him some more opportunities, but the extreme positive for Gibson is that he's averaging 18 opportunities per game, which is targets and carries combined. That's about 3 more per game than he had last year, and the 18 per game is among the top 10 in running backs. Washington, they only have 2 green zone rushes on the season, 1 each for McKissic and 1 each for Gibson. That's likely because they have a red zone passing rate of 76%, which is second in the league only to the Pittsburgh Steelers. So I was thinking, as I was writing this up, how I would rank the 4 running backs between these 2 backfields. And I'd certainly put McKissic 4th and Hines 3rd, but I flip-flopped about a dozen times on whether I'd take Gibson or Taylor, because on one hand, I think Gibson has a better chance of taking the receiving work from McKissic. Hines is, I think, much better than McKissic just from a talent perspective. On the other hand, Taylor is getting the red zone and green zone work that Gibson is not. And I asked Pete and Pat what they thought, and they were split. One of them said Taylor and one of them said Gibson. So that didn't really help. I think I initially leaned Gibson because again, what I said, he has the opportunity to take the passing down work, I believe, a little bit more in Washington's offense than I do Indianapolis's. So they're both really close, and I'll leave it up to you guys to decide. Moving on, the Arizona Cardinals. This is another 2-man backfield, but is quite a bit different. Right now, Chase Edmonds has a stranglehold on the receiving work. James Conner has been trusted as the short area and red zone threat. And I referenced the red zone snaps earlier, but James Conner is actually 7th in red zone snap share at 71%, and his teammate Chase Edmonds is actually not among the top 15 running backs. But Edmonds is actually tied for the team lead in targets and is one of 3 players on the Cardinals averaging 6 targets per game right now. And Edmonds is seeing elite passing work with an average of just over 9 receiving expected points per game. You can see he's pretty high up there on the chart right here. And he has a near league median in rushing expected points. So that's good. It's not like some of these other guys, Nyheim Hines you see over here, James White, who have a lot of receiving work but don't get as much rushing work. Fortunately, it doesn't look like Conner is going to sniff any relevancy in the passing game, since he's only running a route on 6% of dropbacks compared to a whopping 67% for Edmonds. So Conner is a complete non-factor as a receiver after being a solid receiving back with Pittsburgh. And this, I think, actually bodes well for Edmonds, because the Cardinals are 10th in the league in pass rate over expectation at almost 5% and have a positive pass rate over expectation in the red zone. I've also mentioned before that I think Kyler Murray is their true goal line back. He has 3 green zone carries so far this year, but Connor has had at least one of those in every game. Edmonds did get 1 green zone rush from the 2-yard line. He wound up inches short, so he could have had a bigger day if he had gotten that one across the goal line. But the following play, they ran a play action boot with Kyler on the next play, and I don't know why they don't do that more often, because it was a really good play, and it's easy for Kyler Murray to get out. But all this to say, Edmonds is still a fantasy starter. He's, I think, a solid running back 2 that'll give you some good consistency with his work in the passing game. He's averaging 14.5 PPR points per game and has at least a dozen PPR points in each game this season. I'm also not trusting Connor in a lineup at this point unless I'm pretty desperate or playing DFS, but I'm still holding on to him because if Edmonds does go down, then that's probably the case where he could start getting some pass catching work. So I really didn't plan it this way, but I'm glad it's working out this way, because I'm switching over to the next chart here again, looking at just week 3 and going to talk about the Carolina Panthers. Unfortunately, the injury to Christian McCaffrey, it sounds like he may be out for a little bit. Not quite sure. They haven't put him on injured reserve. I think the positive news for CMC managers is that Edwin Porras of Fantasy Points, a really good injury analyst for them, thinks that this could end up being a single game absence. And the game that he got hurt during being played on Thursday night certainly helps that. But it really was the only way that we could hinder the 101 teams who took CMC first overall. But the 2 guys in the Panthers backfield to highlight are Chuba Hubbard and Royce Freeman. And simply put, Hubbard is the guy to roster right now. If you're not familiar with his work, he played college ball at Oklahoma State. He was hurt in his final season, so he didn't play much, but he did have a 2,000-yard and 21 touchdown season. I think, if I remember correctly, a lot of people had him as one of the top running backs for the 2021 class going into this past season, but the injuries lowered his stock. But Hubbard ran a route on 51% of dropbacks in the game on Thursday night, compared to just 14% for Freeman. This gave Hubbard a 12-point receiving EP for the week, which is tremendous. And on top of 7 rush EP is really, really good. He had a -8 FPO in this game, so could not convert on his opportunities. But that's, again, being thrust into a sort of workhorse role on a short week in a game that he wasn't expecting to have as much. But Hubbard also had a sizable lead in opportunities in this game with 16 compared to just 6 for Royce Freeman. They each had 1 green zone rush. And if Hubbard gets this much of the workload, then we'll be talking about him in the same light as Mike Davis. All this said, I think Royce Freeman is certainly worth an add, and I'm sure the guys will talk tomorrow about him and potentially how much to be bidding on him in leagues, because he's probably, he's going to get some work, and I'm not sure that the Panthers trust Hubbard as much as they did Mike Davis last year, but there were some guys that got some ancillary work, and Hubbard is, I don't think, as good as Mike Davis either. So to wrap up the running back section, have a couple, actually quite a bit of quick nuggets here. In the game this past weekend, Javonte Williams had a season high 4 targets this week, which is the most for a Denver running back in a game this season. But Williams is still running far fewer routes than Melvin Gordon. Gordon is at a routes run rate of 54% this season, while Javonte is at 31%. And Hayden Winks, in one of his articles, I can't remember the name of it, but pointed out that about almost 50% of Williams' opportunities have come when the team has had a win probability of 95% or greater. So I touched on them last week. I think Gordon is the clear 1A and Williams the 1B, but if he's efficient enough, both could be starters. Saquon Barkley this past week saw 7 targets and has a 75% routes run rate over the last 2 weeks. And with so many injuries to the Giants pass catchers, his floor will likely rise with increased work in the passing game. Excuse me. And speaking of bell cow backs, Alvin Kamara is all that and more right now. He is averaging 22 opportunities per game this season. Before the season started, he didn't have a year with more than 19.6 opportunities per game in his career. He also ran a route on a nice 69% of snaps on Sunday. So he is just looking like a really solid fantasy running back right now. There's no other way to say it. I think I'll plan to talk about the Jags running backs next week, but for now, it looks a bit more clearly that Robinson is, in fact, the lead back. He's averaging 21 opportunities per game compared to just 8 for Hyde, but he's not getting that 90% opportunity share that he saw last year, which combined with this offense probably makes him an RB2. From Ben Gretsch in his Stealing Signals newsletter, highly recommend you subscribe to that. Austin Ekeler had a 74% snap rate, which was the 4th highest snap rate of his career. For some reason, Larry Roundtree got some goal line work in the game against the Chiefs, but didn't really do much with it. So not that concerned. Ekeler is looking like an RB1, potentially a top 5 running back right now, which is really awesome. From Austin Gale of PFF, Najee Harris has been hit at or behind the line of scrimmage on 70% of his carries, which is the highest rate in the NFL. Fortunately, he got 19 targets on Sunday, which is why you see him just totally messing up the scale on this chart. It's absurd. I think if the Steelers pass catchers are injured, he might be the next best guy for Ben to target because Ben has a noodle arm at this point. Darrell Henderson didn't play this week, but Sony Michel played 74% of the snaps without him. He outsnapped Jake Funk by 34 targets. Crosby obviously not very happy about that, flicking the door stopper over there. But anyway, Michel had 20 carries to just 1 for Funk. He ran 22 routes to just 12 for Funk and had 4 targets while Funk had 0. So if Henderson does miss more time, then Michel is probably a locked and loaded RB2 at this point. Moving on to the wide receiver position. And in the chart here, we have weighted targets per route run, like I mentioned at the top of the show, on the x-axis, air yards market share on the y-axis. Crosby apparently allergic to everything. Sorry for the disturbance there. And then the size of a player's bubble is his fantasy points over expectation. Going to start off with the Bears wide receivers who are allergic to fantasy points right now. And it's bleak out there for all the Bears wide receivers. I think the only person we have to blame is Matt Nagy. At least that's who I'm going to blame, because it's really bad, guys. As a unit, the Bears have 61.9 PPR points on the season. That's among all Bears wide receivers. There are 6 wide receivers in the league that have at least that many on their own. Brandon Cooks has 61.7 PPR points, which is just incredible. But here's the good news. The concentration of targets at the top between Allen Robinson and Darnell Mooney is quite concentrated. That duo is among the highest combined target share of top two wide receivers in the league. Robinson is averaging 7 targets while Mooney is averaging just over 6 targets. The problem is that's 2.5 targets per game fewer for Robinson than he had last year, not to mention the quality of the targets just really isn't there. You can see that both Mooney and Allen Robinson are in or near the bottom left quadrant of this chart that we don't want to see. And Robinson is running a route on only 87% of dropbacks. And I say only because Darnell Mooney is all the way up there at 97%, which is not what you want to see out of a third-round pick in Allen Robinson. What's also concerning is that Robinson's average depth of target is down to 6.5 yards this year from nearly 10 yards last year. And this is across the board for the Bears wide receivers. Mooney's ADOT has dropped over 4 yards from about 11.8 yards last year to 7.25 this year. And between Dalton and Fields this year, the Bears are averaging a paltry 148 air yards per game, which is dead last in the league and is quite pathetic. If you're looking for another bright spot, the Bears do play the Lions this week, so this could finally be the game that one of them breaks out. I believe they've each scored a touchdown at this point, but it hasn't been for blow-up performances. I think there are one of two ways you could play this, depending on where you're at and whether you have either, Allen Robinson. If you have Robinson, you pray that he has a big game this week, and then I think sell high and share some of these peripheral stats that I've talked about, showing that the opportunity is there. He just hasn't been able to, make good on them, because I don't think the success is sustainable. And then 2, if you don't have Robinson, you buy low now and hope to God that Matt Nagy figures this shit out, because hopefully the ADOT increases for both of these guys. Justin Fields was one of the best deep ball passers in college when he played. So I really just hope that things turn around for the Bears wide receivers. Moving on, I'm going to talk about the Rams wide receivers. In case you did not know, Cooper Kupp and Matthew Stafford eat breakfast every single day, which is the only reason why Cooper Kupp is the wide receiver 1 on the season. I'm just kidding. But Kupp is just having such a dominant season. In PPR, he's averaging 5 PPR points per game. Then the wide receiver 2, which is Mike Williams, he's averaging almost 10 PPR points per game more than the wide receiver 3. And this is truly league-winning production right now. Don't really need to talk about him that much, because what you're doing with him is starting him, and I wouldn't sell high on him either. But what we do need to talk about is Robert Woods, who just hasn't had any fantasy production, despite some really good underlying numbers. The Rams are actually 6th in pass rate over expectation on the season, which is great. Woods has a 20% target share, which in a vacuum is really solid for a receiver, but Kupp is just dominating the targets with a whopping 37% target share. Woods' ADOT on the flip side of the Bears has actually risen by 2 yards, which is also really good to see. He has a 0.57 weighted targets per out run, which is still second on the team, but he's running fewer routes than Van Jefferson. It's only 1 across the season, so there's no need to overreact. But it's worth mentioning, because in years past, Woods was running routes on 90+% of dropbacks, and now he's down to just 84% this season. I'm not sure that it's really a great buy low opportunity right now, because I think that Kupp is the better receiver and has way more upside. As we've seen at this point, we'll just hope that the opportunity flattens out a little bit for the rest of the season. The other part of this puzzle is Tyler Higbee, who's running almost as many routes as Woods and Jefferson are, and despite a down game in week 2 has looked pretty solid. I wouldn't think about adding Van Jefferson yet because he's competing with Deshaun Jackson for targets. Jackson only has 7 targets on the season and obviously had the big game this past week with his long touchdown, proving once again that he's better in best ball. But I think the top 3 receivers right now are Kupp, obviously Woods, and then Higbee, who's obviously tight end. Next up, I'm going to talk about the Buffalo Bills wide receivers. I talked about Josh Allen at the top of the show. I've spent the last couple of weeks talking about the Bills backfield, but I'm going to shift the focus this week to their wide receiver core because they are once again near the top of the league in pass rate over expectation. The Bills are. Not only that, but there's a bit of concern out there for those who drafted Stefon Diggs that despite passing so much and Josh Allen continuing to dominate through the air, that he's not really paying off his first round value at this point. And I am here to calm your mind and tell you not to panic and tell you why Diggs, I think, is in the perfect buy low opportunity right now. So first of all, Diggs is averaging just over 10 targets per game so far this season. And last year, when he led the league in targets, he averaged just over 10 targets per game. He hasn't been able to produce yet, as he has yet to eclipse 70 receiving yards in a single game this season, but his average depth of target has risen nearly 2.5 yards from last year, going from 10.3 yards in 2020 to now 12.8 in 2021. So he's seeing more deep targets. Him and Allen just need to connect on those, and they will eventually, and he'll turn in a monster game. Hopefully it is this week. Diggs is averaging negative 3.7 FPO per game so far, which, as I've mentioned several times, is one of the biggest signals for positive regression. His 18.3 receiving expected points per game is still elite. It's among the top 8 receivers. And the final thing I want to point out is the completion percentage over expectation for each of the top 4 receivers when they are targeted. For Emmanuel Sanders, and Cole Beasley, actually, it's a little over 4%. Gabe Davis, it's about 1.5%. For Stefon Diggs, it's negative 1.7%. So there's a CPOE of negative 1.7% when Josh Allen is targeting Stefon Diggs, which essentially means that they should be completing more of the targets that you would expect. So all of this to say, I think Diggs is in a perfect buy low opportunity. I thought Ben Gretchen, his newsletter yesterday, put into context really well that you should be trying to trade guys like Mike Williams, Deebo Samuel, potentially even Jamar Chase for Diggs, given the pass rate discrepancies, because I just trust Diggs' consistency over any of these other guys who have had extremely efficient starts. But I'm going to talk about the other guys real quick here. Gabriel Davis is the clear 4th guy in this wide receiver room. He's only got 6 total targets on the year. You can hold on to him for now because I think because of how much the Bills pass, and an injury to any one of these guys would open up an opportunity for him, but he's more than a DFS dart throw at this point. Emmanuel Sanders is the surprise so far, as he leads the Bills receivers with an ADOT of nearly 17 yards and has basically taken the role that we all thought Gabe Davis would have and hoped would have Beasley is just the same. He's been in the past a low A-dot target hog. He actually isn't that far behind Diggs as he has just two fewer targets on the season. And despite having a lower A-dot at 5.6 yards, so almost 12 yards shorter than Sanders, Beasley has a higher weighted targets per route run at 0.54 than Sanders does, who's at 0.5 flat. Beasley and Sanders are probably both flex plays at this point right now. And like I said, Diggs is in what I think is the perfect buy low window right now. Going to talk lastly about another AFC East wide receiver group, and that's the Patriots wide receivers. And let me start this off by saying that Mac Jones had 633 air yards in week 3, which is just incredible. But a lot of that came in the last couple minutes of the game when the outcome had already been decided. So some of these numbers may be a bit skewed, and some of the numbers you might be a bit skewed. Excuse my mix up there, but I still want to explore the Patriots receivers because the Patriots have a positive pass rate over expectation right now, while they were near the bottom, if not at the bottom of the league last year with Cam Newton. And also have to keep in mind that the Patriots use their tight ends and running backs in the passing game a little more than other teams do, and we'll see how that changes with James White's injury. But I say all this because Kendrick Bourne, Nelson Aguilar, and Jacoby Myers are the only 3 Patriots wide receivers to record a target so far this season. So another instance of concentration of targets among the position group, but Aguilar and Jacoby Myers both lead the team in routes per dropback rate at 91 and 96% respectively. And Bourne isn't actually that far behind the two of them at 73%. But for all intents and purposes, Aguilar and Myers are the number 1 and number 2. They both play very different roles, which is good. 87% of Myers' routes have come from the slot, and 97% of Aguilar's routes have come from out wide. Myers has some clear separation, though. He's got a 0.58 weighted targets per route run, and a 0.55 Whopper, both leading the team, but he's struggling with efficiency, averaging -4 FPO per game. His 25% target share does lead the team by 10%, which is outstanding, and he's averaging almost 10 targets per game. And man, if only Alvin Robinson could see that much volume. But Myers is probably a fringe wide receiver 3 at this point. Aguilar, a wide receiver 4 that you probably only want to play if you're desperate. But I think both will be obviously solid bye week fill-ins and could have some boom weeks for DFS purposes, depending on who they're playing in the upcoming week. Some final nuggets on wide receivers. Odell Beckham Jr. got back into the lineup. He started his first game of the year. Actually looked pretty solid. He led the team in targets, and no other receiver or tight end had more than 3 targets on the game. I've talked about the Browns a bit this year and how they need target concentration for any of them to be valuable. So if it stays this week, then OBJ could be a solid wide receiver 2, but we'll see how soon Landry is back and whether he's able to maintain that target share. Chase Claypool had 15 targets on Sunday, which was a career high, but that was without Deontay Johnson playing at all and without Juju Smith-Schuster for part of the game. I think it's more noise that his average depth of target is at 7.2 yards right now because he's been the deep threat. He's sort of been forced into shorter targets with the other 2 receivers missing time and Ben Roethlisberger, like I said, having a noodle for an arm. From Jack Miller and his amazing strength in numbers article, which I'd highly recommend you read, Brandon Aiyuk ran more routes in week 3 than he did in the first 2 weeks combined. He also caught a touchdown this past week. So it looks like he's out of the doghouse, which is really promising. And then Kalief Raymond just completely put to bed the whole Quintez Cephus wide receiver 1 train that I was driving last week. He had 10 targets, compared to just 1 target for Cephus in week 3. Cephus's routes per dropback rate dropped a little bit from 90% the week before to 68% this week, but Raymond has a route rate of at least 64% in each of the first 3 games. The positive is that, again, these two play very different roles. Raymond, primarily a slot guy, at a 63% slot rate compared to just a 10% slot rate for Quintez Cephus. The next position we've got is the tight end position. Going to run through this one pretty quick so I don't go too long, but the Panthers tight ends, rest in peace to the Darnold to Dan Arnold connection, and got some questions about whether Tommy Tremble is now the lead tight end and if he's worth adding. Matt Rule called Tremble the Jeremy Chin of this year, so that's something. If you don't know who Tremble is, the Panthers took him with a 3rd-round pick this year. He's pretty athletic. He's 6'3", 240 pounds, but didn't have great production. So I don't think he's worth an add at this point. He only ran a route on 18% of dropbacks on Thursday Night Football. He played a 26% snap share, and he got the freaking carry inside the 10, but only had 1 other target outside of that. Ian Thomas played a higher snap share at 51%, which was actually the highest among the 3 tight ends, including Dan Arnold. On Thursday, he's had a snap share over 50% in each of the first 3 games, but he only ran 1 more route than Tremble on Thursday. I think if you want to try to get ahead of the curve, you could add Tremble, but if he doesn't do anything this next week, then you can drop him. They play the Cowboys. And I updated another reason why is I updated the target concentration chart that I shared last week. And the top 3 targeted players for Carolina are DJ Moore, Christian McCaffrey, and Terrace Marshall. And as phased out as he seems, Robbie Anderson is probably the 4th option, making Tremble at best the 5th option. We have confidence restored in George Kittle managers as he was 2nd on the team in targets this week with 9. He also just looked like himself on the running catch that he had on, or I believe was the last drive that he nearly took to the house. This is his 2nd straight game with a routes per dropback rate over 80% and jumped all the way up to 82 air yards this week, which led the team. Kittle's still going to need to be efficient because San Francisco ranks in the bottom 3rd in the league in pass rate over expectation at negative 2.5%. And Kittle's career high touchdowns in a season is 5. And I honestly wouldn't be surprised if he didn't hit that this year, especially since, like I mentioned, Aiyuk is out of the doghouse and Deebo Samuel is playing extremely well. But you're going to keep starting George Kittle and just have a little bit more confidence in it going forward. A couple other things to wrap up the tight end section. Dalton Schultz is now the tight end 5 on the year, which is just hilarious. Only Kelsey, Gronk, Hawkinson, and Waller have scored more than him so far. He looks like he might be the biggest beneficiary of the Gallup absence and is most certainly worth an add if he is on your waiver wire. And finally, Dawson Knox ran a route on over 75% of dropbacks for the 2nd straight week. So potentially could add him. I'd probably add both Schultz and Knox before I'm adding Tommy Tremble for sure. Here's the chart for just week 3. Obviously, you see Dalton Schultz with a really big game. Mark Andrews also with one of his best games in quite some time. Going to wrap up the show with a team-by-team look at 3 teams, starting with the worst of the bunch, the Atlanta Falcons. Just a goddamn mess right now. Arthur Smith, a.k.a. Thickless Cage, has just ruined this team, unfortunately, and Matt Ryan doesn't look like he's good enough anymore to put the team on his back. Like, I don't know how you can explain Kyle Pitts, the 4th overall pick, getting 3 targets, and the first one not coming until the second half. But more on that later. Let's talk about Matt Ryan first. He just isn't throwing that well. He is at the bottom of the league in passing air yards. I mentioned the Bears earlier. Matt Ryan is just above them in air yards. So he is no longer a fantasy quarterback starter at this point, except in 2 quarterback leagues, but just not looking great for him right now. The running backs is really, it's so crazy. Gonna get into my 30 for 30 voice here. What if I told you that Cordarrelle Patterson would lead the Falcons in fantasy points through 3 weeks? Because he is. Like, he has the most fantasy points among the Atlanta Falcons through 3 weeks. You'd probably think I was crazy if I said that, because they have, like I said, they have Matt Ryan, who is a quarterback, and they always score more points, almost always score more points than the backup running back. And Patterson is the backup running back. At least that's what we think. They have freaking Calvin Ridley and Kyle Pitts, so you'd think they might be scoring more, but here we are. Patterson is averaging 16 PPR points per game. He's seen at least 13 opportunities in each of the last 2 games and is averaging 12 opportunities per game. But what's crazy is that, again, Mike Davis, their actual lead running back, presumably at least, is averaging nearly 18 opportunities per game and has a 67% snap share on the year, while Patterson has just a 36% snap share. So both of these guys are probably startable right now. It seems like the offense is going through them because none of the other guys are producing that well, but it's just such a weird situation. But back to Kyle Pitts and the rest of the pass catchers. The good for Pitts is that his routes per dropback rate has increased every week this season. The bad is that his targets have dropped in every week this season. The ugly is that he's tight end 9 on the season, despite averaging 8.3 PPR points per game. And again, that just shows you what the tight end landscape is like. Calvin Ridley has run a route on 95% of dropbacks, is averaging nearly 20 receiving expected points per game, which is 6th most among all wide receivers, and he's averaging -6 FPO per game. So he just hasn't been super efficient. I think Calvin Ridley is probably the best buy low opportunity on this offense. Pitts being a rookie tight end, we should expect him to have some growing pains. Being, these are the first 3 games of his career in the NFL, and it might just take him some time to adjust. But the 3 targets this past week are just unforgivable, Arthur Smith. Unfortunately, I have to mention Olamide Zaccheaus. He honestly really should be the Falcons wide receiver 2. I think he's better than Russell Gage, at least from what I've seen in the 37 hours of film that I've watched in the last 12 hours. But in all seriousness, he's essentially just filling in for Gage's role. He had 12 receiving expected points this week and ran a route on 72% of dropbacks. So only have value, really, I think, if Gage is out. But credit to Silas in the Discord for making that call, much to my dismay. Let's turn things around. Let's get a little bit more positive. We got the Baltimore Ravens, and these team charts I should have mentioned are, again, looking at the last 3 weeks of data. Going to do a rolling average for these. Lamar Jackson, we all know who he is. He has a positive CPOE on the year, which is on pace for how he's played the last couple of years. What's wild is he's averaging more passing and more rushing yards than he did in his MVP season in 2019. He's averaging 3 more rushing yards per game so far this season and 46 more passing yards per game. So been a little bit less efficient in terms of interceptions and touchdowns, but yeah, he's the real deal again. The running backs, however, Tyson Williams looks like and probably is the best running back in this backfield, but unfortunately he's not really being treated like it. He's averaging 0.64 rushing yards over expectation, which is 17th in the league. He actually does lead the league in EPA per rush among running backs with at least 10 carries this season. And Williams has played exactly 50% of the snaps so far, is averaging just over 11 opportunities per game. So that makes him probably a low-end RB2, high-end RB3, given this offense. But Latavius Murray is not far behind him. He's playing on just 33% of snaps. I guess what's encouraging for Williams is that Murray's opportunities have dropped in each game so far this season. Murray had more carries than Tyson this past week. It was a wonky game script, obviously. Kicked the amazing game-winning field goal from Justin Tucker, but the difference-making point, I think, for me, for Tyson, is that he is the only running back who's gotten a target this year on the Ravens and is actually running a route on 47% of dropbacks, which is pretty solid for a running back. Moving on to the pass catchers, unfortunately, I'll have to wait to talk about the Ravens wide receiver 1, Rashad Bateman, until hopefully next week. But in the meantime, I guess I'll talk about Marquise Brown, who just triggered managers this past week. He dropped several long touchdowns in the game on Sunday. He still leads the team in target share so far this year at 28%, but Sammy Watkins only has 1 fewer targets so far this year. Watkins is actually running a route on a higher percent of dropbacks than Brown, so he's carved himself a nice role, but Brown has a bigger edge in weighted targets per route run at 0.78 compared to 0.62 for Watkins. And Brown's usage of 16 expected points per game is actually among the top 20 wide receivers in the league. He's just not converting as much on the opportunities that he's been getting. Like I said, Mark Andrews ended up having one of his best games in a while. His 109 receiving yards on Sunday were the second, the second highest total of his career, and only the 3rd time he's reached 100 yards. What's crazy is that he did this running a route on 77% of dropbacks, which was his lowest rate of the season, but his 88% route rate on the season is outstanding and is among the top 5 tight ends. And Andrews remains a top 6 tight end at this point. Last team I'm going to talk about are my Green Bay Packers. Aaron Rodgers is a bad man. Excluding the week 1 debacle, Rodgers is averaging about 23 fantasy points per game. He has an adjusted yards per attempt of 11 yards and has thrown for 6 touchdowns. He's got an 8.6% CPOE, which is top 10 in the league. So he hasn't really slowed down off of his MVP pace and performance, just a bona fide quarterback 1 that may have some down games with the Packers relying on the run a little bit more, but it'll be impossible to predict those games. So just start them and hope for the best. The running backs, I'm not going to lie, it looked like A.J. Dillon was on the field a lot more in week 3 than he had been in the past. Maybe it was because he was actually getting them when the game was competitive, but His snap share in the game on Sunday was right at 29%, and he has a 29% snap share overall in the season. He did get 8 opportunities in the game, but he doesn't have a single green zone touch, as that part of the field is dominated by Aaron Jones, who is still the lead guy in this backfield. He's got a 64% snap share, which was, again, brought down significantly by the 49% snap share in week 1 when they got blowout. He's got 20 plus opportunities in each of the last 2 weeks. And hate to be the bearer of bad news, but it's likely going to take an injury to Aaron Jones for AJ Dillon to break out, unless we see some more encouraging numbers going forward. In terms of the pass catchers, Rodgers is just locked onto Davante Adams once again, and rightfully so. He has a target share of 37% and an air yard share of 47%, which is just absurd. There were reports late in the offseason that MVS, Marquez Valdes-Scantling, was going to be the team's wide receiver 2, and that seems to have come to fruition. He's second on the team in targets, has a target share of 18%. Aaron Jones is actually the only other player with a target share above 10%, excuse me, and he's at 11%. But at this point, MVS is a very boom-bust wide receiver 4. He gets those deep shots and isn't always able to convert on them. Robert Tonyan has clearly regressed at this point. He's averaging just 2 receptions per game, less than 3 targets per game. He still has a solid 64% routes per dropback rate on the season, but his weighted targets per route run is below Randall Cobb. So he's still probably worth holding on to given the offense that he's in, but it looks like MVS has overtaken him as Rodgers' second or third option right now. Before I close out the show, had one final question that I thought was really good from common opponent in the Discord. His question was, what player or situation are you having trouble parsing signal on after 3 games? And 2 things stood out to me. The first is Derrick Henry's receiving. That's certainly something that stood out to me. I talked about him on the show last week, but he's got a solid routes per dropback rate. He's catching several balls. I'm not quite sure if this is a function of the game scripts that the Titans have been in. I'm leaning no, because Jeremy McNichols is getting involved as well, but that's something that I don't totally trust yet. And then the second one is that from a team level situation, are the Raiders and the Bengals pass rates going to hold? The Raiders are currently at the top of the league in pass rate over expectation, which might be more. Now, it's not more shocking than the Bengals pass rate, but does the Raiders pass rate change when Josh Jacobs returns? Peyton Barber has looked like a fine replacement for Josh Jacobs right now. And then does the passing of time, Joe Burrow's health getting better and having more confidence in him change the Bengals pass rate situation? I sure hope it does. And when it does, we'll talk about that here on Ship Chasing, on Stat Chasing as well. Be sure to subscribe to the YouTube channel, become a member for just $5 a month. Hope you all enjoyed the show today, and we'll see you next week.